Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skift's LinkedIn Live today on the global grounding. We are going to talk about all things economics, all things the economy, all things about the market, and how the slowdown, perceived slowdown that's going on is impacting travel. So I'm joined today by my intrepid co-host, Seth Borko, head of research here at Skift. So Seth and I talk all the time. You all are used to seeing us together, but we are joined today by Skift's managing editor, Lex Harris, who I work with all day, every day, but you guys don't get to see as much. So welcome, Seth and Lex.
Hey, Sarah and Seth.
Great to be here. Great to have you, Lex, in particular. We're excited about
Thank
this
you,
one.
Seth. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, absolutely. So this is how it's all going to work today. Seth is going to give a bit of a presentation, some PowerPoint, some great charts, all the nerd out stuff that we're accustomed to from Seth. It'll all be here in the first part. Then the three of us are going to talk for, about 15 or 20 minutes. And while we're doing that, get your questions ready. You can put them into the chat. And then we're going to take some Q&A and answer all of your burning questions about the economy and how it impacts the travel industry. So with that, Seth, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to ask Monica, our producer, to pull up my slides. And like Sarah said, what is it? You can't start a presentation without a slide deck. So I'm going to try and spend 10 or 15 minutes, go through some slides, share some numbers and some thoughts with you all. And hopefully they are a starter for a conversation between Sarah and Lex and myself, and also a conversation between all of us. And put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them. So let's start. The idea is global grounding of the economy, the slowdown that we're seeing, the impact of Trump and tariffs and all that stuff, and travel bans on travel. What does it mean? So we did, I won't say warned you, we did highlight in our megatrends in January Trump 2.0, and the trend was literally Trump shakes up travel. We call them the elephant in the room for those red GOP elephants. And we have a couple of different ways, many, many, many different ways that the current presidential administration can impact travel industry, from immigration and trade wars and travel bans. We said potential. They're becoming increasingly real. FAA administrator, but also, there's also positive things, right? Lower taxes, less regulation, potentially. Well, we'll decide if looser sustainability is a good thing or not. But there's a lot that Trump can and has already done. When we asked people, when we did our megatrends, people seemed generally optimistic, though, about what Trump would mean for the economy and for travel. I don't know that necessarily people do truly feel that way anymore. There has been quite a difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. One teeny tiny little difference, which is, at least so far, has been the stock market. Oh, well, many differences, but the measurer of which has been the stock market. Whereas Trump 1.0 saw a very large S&P 500 rally over the course of his first 4 years, his term. Since Trump's inauguration, we've seen a pretty large market sell-off. And let's not call it large, but we've seen a market sell-off. We've seen concerns, and we've seen a lot of fears and slowdowns. And we want to talk specifically about what Trumponomics 2.0 means for travel. And the way that we've been thinking about on the Skift Research team, there's really 4 core Trump policy levers that he can and maybe even will pull, is pulling as we speak, that impact the travel industry. And I want to talk about how each of these will impact the travel industry, both in the U.S. and abroad. There's the travel ban, which Trump has teased, in terms of actually banning or highly restricting visitors from certain countries. There's tariffs, and there's trade wars. There's just overall sentiment called the vibe. And then there's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that we've seen a lot of headlines and, frankly, action and cuts and news headlines about. So we're going to touch on these 4 points. So first, the travel ban. So Donald Trump has talked about taking a bunch of different countries and putting them on a series of lists: a red list of full bans, an orange list of highly restricted visas, and a yellow list of 60-day, 90-day warning. If you don't shape up or meet certain policy goals that we have for your country, you will be added to one of these other ban lists. Now, we counted it up, and it's about 700,000 relative to 2024. About 700,000 inbound travelers to the United States would have been caught up in one of these 3 levels of the travel ban. About half in the orange list, about half in the red list, and a small share in that yellow list. Obviously, these headlines matter and policy matters, but as far as an actual dollars and cents impact, I think it's worth pointing out that we are talking about a relatively small portion of inbound travel to the United States. So again, looking at the countries that are on the leaked draft list relative to actual historical visitors from those countries, we're talking somewhere in the order of 1 to 3%, in most recent years, 1.5% of inbound visitors to the United States having any restriction be on any of these three lists. So these policies matter, but 1% of inbound travelers is not going to be a huge dollar and cents figure for the travel industry. The second of those four buckets was about tariffs and trade. And here, it's very hard. Well, I guess it's not impossible, but it's hard to tariff travel directly. Tariffs usually apply to something like a product, like an actual physical good that is imported or exported. Travel is a service and therefore not directly tariffed. And so far, there's really not a direct impact of actual tariff policy on trade to the United States. But I do want to point out that many economists believe that tariffs lead, in general, to stronger currencies, right? If you think about it, tariffs, the goal of a tariff is to reduce imports. What an import does is an importer in the United States would sell a US dollar to buy a Korean won, to then buy a Korean car and import it into the United States. Less imports means less of those importers in the United States selling US dollars. Less pressure on selling dollars means generally a stronger dollar. And a stronger dollar generally means less tourism to the United States. So this is a bit of a second order impact. There's not necessarily a first order direct impact of a tariff on the US. There are some second order impacts. One is that the dollar would potentially rise, making it harder for visitors to visit the US. And about 10% of the growth in inbound tourism is impacted by US dollar in our estimation. There's also second order impacts in terms of if the supply chain gets more expensive, if goods get more expensive, then the price of travel could rise. Like basically, tariffs could lead to inflation. Inflation could make travel to the US more expensive. It could also make the dollar higher, which would also make travel potentially more expensive. So when we look at tariffs, there's a limited direct hit, but there are second order indirect impacts that could make the US more expensive as a destination. But the real impact of tariffs and travel bans and all these things, even though they don't add up to a lot in terms of dollars, what matters is sentiment. So what are tariffs and immigration policy and trade wars telling people about the United States, and how does it make them more or less likely to visit the United States? And look, this is the really hard one to measure. It's also probably the one that matters the most in terms of dollars and cents again. So sentiment, yes, the vibes matter. So we are measuring here Canadian residents returning from the U.S. by air. Presumably, this is return trips to Canada from Statistics Canada. Presumably, the reason why they returned from Canada is because they left Canada in the first place and they're flying to the United States. So far, we are trending on average about a 12% reduction in Canadian residents traveling cross-border U.S.-Canada. So about a 10% reduction. So we are seeing a real impact. We've seen it reported. There can be millions, if not billions, of dollars at stake from Canadian tensions, and we have heard and seen stories and reporting about Canadians avoiding travel to the United States. However, I do think we need to temper some of this impact of sentiment. We're looking at here is seat capacity, scheduled seats flown between the United States and Canada, broken out by seats flown by Air Canada, seats flown by WestJet. Those are the two largest Canadian airlines. And then also just total seats flown back and forth between the U.S. and Canada across any airlines, including U.S. air carriers. And what we're looking at is how those air carriers have scheduled their seat capacity for this year, in both in Q1 past and into the future in 2025, their schedule relative to 2024. And what we see is Air Canada has started to make some big cuts, 5% and 3% cuts in Q1 and Q2. We've seen WestJet trim a little bit, but the overall impact has been some cuts, but capacity is still scheduled to actually grow between these two nations. And so we are seeing some impact in sentiment. We are definitely seeing that Canadians, which have been a real target of tariffs and also of a 51st state rhetoric, we are definitely seeing Canadians say, maybe I don't want to travel to the United States right now. Maybe I'll cancel or defer my trip to the United States. We have seen Air Canada respond and cut some of its seat capacity. But all of these things are in the order of magnitude of, call it 5 to 10% cuts, and maybe not like fully baked into Q3 and Q4. People are kind of thinking maybe it might change into the year end. And so the sentiment is definitely shifting and impacting travel to the U.S. I also think it's worth remembering, though, that, well, Trump is a polarizing figure, and some people hate him and some people love him. And the people that love him and the people that hate him, they also exist outside the United States as well. So when we say, yeah, sentiment is getting worse, there might be some people for whom sentiment is getting better. This was a survey that we conducted in November of last year, so after the election, but before the inauguration and before some of the more bombastic statements that Trump has made in recent weeks. But we did a European traveler survey, and we said, has your interest in the United States been influenced by recent political events or leaderships, for example, the Trump administration? And about 40% of Europeans that we surveyed, it was in 4 countries, the UK, Germany, France, and Spain. About 40% said they were less likely to visit the United States as a result of Trump. And then about 40% said that they were more likely to visit the United States because of Trump. Now, granted, things have changed, and there's a difference between post-election and actually today as we see things play on the ground. Skift Research and our team is literally, like as we speak, working on field and updated survey data. And so if this is a topic that you're interested in, reach out to me directly, reach out to the team. We're going to be publishing more on this. But it's just a reminder that sentiment seems bad, but let's not forget that Trump is divisive for a reason, and there are people who love him, and people who love him also include outside the United States. So there is, when we say there's bad sentiment, there's also an offset in that there can be some good sentiment as well. In the final of those 4 big bubbles, we talked about travel bans, we talked about tariffs, now we're talking about sentiment. The final one of these is DOGE. That's the Department of Government Efficiency, ostensibly maybe run by Elon Musk, maybe officially not, but we know it's run by Elon. And they're looking to find cuts and cost savings across the federal government, and that will certainly impact travel, and we will see probably big cuts in government spending on travel. In fact, we're already seeing that show up in company and analyst commentary. I think, though, it's important to put DOGE in context, and I think, frankly, it's important to put all the stuff that we've talked about in context. This is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is effectively the U.S. travel industry broken down by who is spending the money in 2023. And you can see we break it out. U.S. tourism industry is about $1.6 trillion. $1 trillion of that $1.6 trillion comes from consumer spending. Another $400 billion comes from business spending, corporate travel. Then another $150 billion comes from inbound tourism. And finally, about $45 billion, about $50 billion, comes from the government. Now, $50 billion is an awful lot of money. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that all of government spending is still, less than 3% of the travel industry. If you include its knock-on effects through private companies, government pays a lot of contractors, so it does have spillover effect, but the direct impact of government spending is still relatively small. Inbound travel is about 10% of the U.S. travel industry. So I think it's just worth pointing out that all of these things we're talking about, they're going to add up to billions of dollars. If we see Canadian inbound tourism fall by 10%, which we are already seeing, that could easily be a $2 billion impact. But it's important to have that context that inbound tourism is $152 billion. So it's 2 out of 150, and the total industry is $1.6 trillion. So these will have impacts in the order of magnitude of billions, but we are a $1 trillion industry in the U.S. and almost $10 trillion globally. And so I wanted to try and quantify what some of these government DOGE cuts could mean. So if we think that the U.S. is going to grow U.S. travel industry is going to grow at about 6%, which is about in line with 1.5 to 2 times the pace of GDP, 6% growth means adding about $100 billion in new travel industry sales in the United States in a given year. So let's talk through those different steps that we just talked about. Let's look at the travel ban. Well, we know it's about 2% of inbound travel. So that's about $3 billion. Let's say a stronger U.S. dollar and tariffs and higher costs to travel to the United States, that cuts inbound tourism by 10%. Well, that's about $16 billion. And let's say ill will and bad sentiment, bad vibes towards America cuts inbound tourism by another 10%. That's another $16 billion. And let's say the Department of Government Efficiency cut government travel spending by a huge number, by 50%. That would be $25 billion. So these are big numbers. There would be a little bit of offset. Maybe we say, look, some Americans don't want to travel abroad. They're feeling the ill will. So will they come back and spend their money domestically? So that adds a bit back in. Overall, we think that adds up to $50 billion. That's a huge number. That's a huge impact. But it would bring travel spending down from 6% growth to 3% growth. So all of these Trump policies could cut U.S. travel growth in half, but it probably wouldn't kill or even necessarily put travel into a recession where we actually see travel decline. And so I think that's kind of one of the core points here, which is that All of this matters. Everything that Trump is doing matters, and it matters both politically and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's all about the consumer. It's all about businesses. In other words, it's really all about the economy. So the number one thing that we need to be watching out for is a recession. And we're seeing that in the news. I will point out that economists have predicted 10 out of the last 2 recessions. Economists love to call for a recession. The news loves to call for a recession. It doesn't always happen, but we shouldn't be dismissive. This is not me trying to be dismissive and say that there's not going to be a recession. There's very, very, very real risks of a recession. We are really seeing signs of a slowdown. I think what's really happening is uncertainty. Uncertainty is very bad for business, and that is what we are seeing in the world and in the economy right now. So this is something called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. It was put together by a bunch of economists as a way to kind of try and quantitatively measure just how much uncertainty we feel in the U.S. economy today. And this chart shows you that we are basically living through one of the most uncertain moments of modern U.S. economic history. Things are about as uncertain today right now as they were during the pandemic, in some ways more uncertain than they were during the 2008 financial crisis. That's really bad for business. It makes it hard for consumers to plan their vacations and plan their spending. It makes it hard for businesses to plan their spending as well. So I'm not saying that there's no chance for a recession. I'm also not saying that a recession is imminent. What we are saying is that ultimately what matters the most for the travel industry is what happens in the economy, and what the economy loves is certainty. That's how you can plan and invest and grow, and that's not what we're getting at this moment in time. We're going to discuss that more in just a second. We're going to talk a lot more about the economy. So what are Skift reporters hearing out there? What do we hear as a team when we go out there? Well, I want to give a couple examples. You've probably seen this headline about Delta lowering its outlook. What's interesting is they said they cited exactly what we're talking about: uncertainty leading to a spending pullback. I do think it's worth asking ourselves, though, how much of the cut in Delta's guidance has to do with safety concerns around flying versus an actual pullback in the consumer. When we've talked to hotel executives like Sean O'Neill, our hotel reporter, they are making it very clear those DOGE cuts are being felt in markets where there's large federal or government spending. Those cuts are very real, but they do say overall demand is still there. They also call out the dollar. So many of the things that we would predict to happen, like a cut in government spending, like stronger dollars, but still overall demand there, but people pausing because of uncertainty, we are seeing a lot of this show up in what we hear and what we report on from travel executives. And again, a quick check from the cruise, which is much more positive. They do say that there are some creeping concerns and competition for travel dollars is rising, but overall, broadly a positive sentiment check from the cruise industry. So airlines less happy, hotels somewhere in between, cruise most positive. And all of this is going to bring us to where we think we can go as a global industry and what our forecast is. Remember, a lot of this is U.S.-centric, but when the U.S. sneezes, the global economy can catch a cold, as the saying goes. So we gave you a base case of mid to high single-digit growth for this year ahead. That was our most likely scenario, and that's based on moderate global GDP growth. But there's, of course, could be a slowdown where we get not moderate GDP growth, but slow GDP growth, and there's even a scenario where we could get a recession. And so what we want to do now is kind of update our forecast and say, look, our base case is now a lot less likely than it was in December of 2024 when we published that. Our slowdown scenario, which would call for really 2 to 5% industry top-line growth, that looks a lot more likely today. And our recession scenario, where the industry actually contracts and shrinks year on year, we thought that was the least likely scenario in December 2024. That is a significant and rise in risk that would pose a real threat to our outlook. So we're updating our forecast. We've tried to quantify some of this Trump bump or lack thereof, or negative bump. What's the opposite of a negative bump? I don't know. Anyways, that is sort of the update to our forecast, to how we're thinking about what Trump means and what the economy means. We are covering this story pretty much every single day. We have a special Trump 100 tag where you can see all of our stories about the first 100 days of Trump in office, where you can see a lot of this reporting that Sarah and Lex are responsible for. So that's going to wrap up the formal presentation piece of this talk, and we're going to open it up to a discussion between Sarah, Lex, and myself. We're going to talk a little more, specifically zero in on the economy and consumer confidence and stuff like that. And hopefully this has inspired some interest and thoughts from you all, and you've got some questions, and we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to pause there, and we'll invite everyone else back on the stage.
All right. Thanks, Seth. We went through this a little bit yesterday, the slides, and it's all just fascinating to me because I've been covering, economics and finance for 25 years. And it's just all so weird. Like, to use the technical term, right?
Yeah.
It's just a very unusual environment. A lot of this that we're talking about was unlike COVID, unlike 2008, where these were big systemic problems that caused the recessions and the uncertainty. This was caused by one or arguably two men. Now, that just happens to be the most powerful man in the world, most definitely in the United States, President Donald Trump. So, are we playing chicken with Donald Trump right now? Is the U.S. consumer playing chicken with Donald Trump right now? Is that what's going on here?
What do you think about this one, Lex? I have a thought, but what do you think?
Yes. First off, it's just striking how quickly things turned, right? It's hard to overstate how excited everyone was post-election, the outlook going into the new year. It all turned in like the last 2 weeks. All of a sudden, everyone's like, oh my God, there's going to be a recession. We're all scared. It all started, in my opinion, with you started to hear comments from Treasury Secretary Trump himself, who is, the biggest booster of them all, unwilling to say there won't be a recession. He kind of deflected when he was asked about it. Then you had in quick succession, something that hits very close to home for us, Delta coming out with its forecast. It is important to note, and Seth's scene setter was so perfect, the president can only do so much, right? It's not the economy, it's $25 trillion economy, whatever it is, it cannot be, policy only affects it so much. So when I kind of take a step back, what I see is people are still spending. People still have jobs. The rich are still really rich. And then in real time, we're calling as many sources as we can. And other than Delta and some of the airlines, business is kind of holding up. So that's what we're watching for. And that's where I'm at right now is people spending, rich are still rich. And we're
getting richer.
Evidence.
They're not even just still rich. They're just getting richer all the time,
And
yeah.
For I think Lex's point is incredibly well said. And for me, it comes back to that uncertainty thing. And this is true both, by the way, in the U.S. and internationally. For some of us wondering, what does this mean for the global tourism and the global economy? There's only so much that the president can directly do. It's really well said. When businesses start to delay investment or delay hiring or delay backfilling or replacing their natural rate of attrition in terms of people quitting or retiring from the workforce, that's when things get scary. And so there is very much a kind of a sentiment, a confidence and a sentiment component to this, which is why people talk about, can you talk yourself into a recession? Where it's like, if we don't get clarity about what we're doing, even if it's up, good or bad, just clarity, then businesses can't plan their hiring, and if they can't plan their hiring, then people start to lose jobs. Then it's no longer what Doge or Elon Musk does. Then it becomes the invisible hand of the market of millions of consumers voting with their wallets, and that's when things start to change in a real fundamental way.
Well, and we just got some numbers actually about consumer sentiment, 2.5 hours ago. And it was really, really interesting. It was kind of like this contradiction that we've been talking about just came right out in those numbers too. The market was gloomy. What were some of the other words they used, Lex?
It perfectly captures, as you just said, everything we're talking about. It was sentence after sentence saying it's the worst ever. It was like worst decline in, I don't know if it was 12 years, worse than 25 years, worse just in a million years, basically.
But we're still going on vacation.
Exactly.
We're still going to travel. And that's the part for, this crew and most of the folks listening who are members of the travel industry. It's kind of the head scratcher a little bit. And it's like, all right, well, what do we do now then? What does that mean for us? And what does it mean for and I think the answer is we're waiting to see. That's the game. That's the game of chicken that we're still kind of
well,
talking about.
we are playing chicken in a sense. I mean, I think that there is an element of make hay while the sun is shining, right? I think that like everyone.
Let's get as many metaphors as we can into this conversation.
Mix our metaphors, yeah,
yeah, exactly.
With Lex, our managing editor here, cut those metaphors. Say what you mean plainly. No, I mean, I think that it's what's funny is that confidence, terrible. What's your confidence about the economy? Terrible. What are you going to do? I'm going to take my vacation. I need a break from all this. I need a break. I need to zone out from the news and from Trump. And so, and as long as you still have a job and you have income, and if you're also a luxury or wealthier traveler, right, then go for it. And I think that's sort of what we are. That's sort of the contradiction too of what we hear from, Skift's own reporting. When we talked to. I showed up a clip from Sinesta, which is a large hotel group. Showed a clip from Carnival, and they're like, Carnival onboard spending looks great. Like. As soon as mom and dad get to turn off the TV and stop listening to Trump, they're swiping that credit card at the Carnival, whatever, right? Like it's happening. So it's definitely.
But that is the key. You said like because it's not just like to hell with it. I'm going to take a vacation. It's like they can. Nothing bad enough has happened to cause you to shift what you would do. And vacations and travel are an important part of household budgets right now. Is it at risk? I mean, as you said, Seth, you're not saying there won't be a recession. So what will it take for it to turn? And the vibe alone isn't enough to make it turn. If you start to see layoffs, if you start to see a meaningful decline in the stock market, not just a 5% decline after 2 years of one of the greatest increases ever, that's when you could start to see a turn. And I just think it's really important right now that we stick to what we know and not just start to try to guess at what these surveys are telling you.
So let's talk a little bit about the luxury traveler. We were just, I read a lot of kind of analysis or guessing in other publications about, really like, is the luxury consumer and for us, the luxury traveler, the ones that are really propping up the whole business? Is that what's actually happening? Now, maybe the Carnival Cruise outlook is an indicator that says,
maybe not
really, not really. It's, obviously that part of the business is strong and will, as we have found, will continue to be strong. Everyone we talk to that's the one thing people can pretty much agree on is that luxury is here to stay. But, what do we think about that? Do you think that this is an economy being propped up by the rich?
I think the latest stat we've seen on it is the top 10%. So this is households making over $250,000 a year account for 50% of consumer spending, which is a huge amount. And a lot of that is driven not just by high incomes, but high levels of assets, so stock market and housing wealth. And so again, until that turns, and I would also say like, that's not good, right? It doesn't feel like a healthy economy. That's like I would put that out as a risk, but it's just if you're talking about where the industry is right now, that's where it is, and it's at least short-term sustainable.
I think it's worth pointing out to an extent that it's the exact ratio of the top 10% support X percent of travel will vary from year to year, and maybe it's higher than it's been. It's ultimately been like it's always going to be some formula of that. Like I think one of the important things I like to remind myself is that travel itself, travel in any form, leisure travel in any form, is a luxury. When we've done some like census-based survey work, there's a shocking amount of American households that don't take any vacations at all. They just can't afford to. They don't have the time, whatever, right? And so, we are in that, like, it's kind of part and parcel of being a discretionary purchase. That said, I think that travel is the single most aspirational thing that anybody can purchase in pretty much globally at this point. And that's true across all chain scales, across mid-scale, upscale, luxury. And so I think people remain very determined to travel. certainly the most dollars are going to come from the luxury travelers, but I wouldn't count out like an economy or mid-scale segment either. Like, I think that you could potentially see like I'm sort of hollowing out of the middle, where people in the middle trade down and say, look, I need a vacation. Travel is a part of who I am. It's how I build my identity. It's how I do the things I love. It's how I see the people I love. And also business, how I get business done. I need to do it. But if I can't afford X, then maybe I can afford something a little cheaper than X. And then you've got the luxury folks who are like, Sarah, we love talking about White Lotus. We're like, White Lotus, wellness, spend, all that stuff. And so I think it's supported by luxury. I would not count out, though, the middle class. I would not count out the middle class.
All right, everybody. So we have chatted on now for quite a bit. It is your turn. Please send your questions in. We're gonna take them here. So I'm looking at the chat, the group chat that we have here going on. I'll take this first one. Oh, here we go. I am more interested in how an economic slowdown may impact Americans traveling outside the U.S. What are your views on what? I'm not sure if this is the same question, but what are your views on the travel? Oh,
it's two different questions.
Yeah.
Here,
Okay.
let's start with this one.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is not that different. How will an economic downturn impact American traveling outside the U.S.? It's the same as domestic, right? Like, it's the consumer that is impacted by sentiment, by confidence, by jobs, by the economy in the U.S. is the same person who's taken a domestic trip or who's going internationally. I think international trips are generally more expensive. So if something starts to turn, you probably see it turn in the outbound international segment first, and then it flows through to domestic. But ultimately, the trend and the directionality for them is effectively the same. Like, you cannot see I think the only way you could see a distinction between domestic and outbound is kind of back to our earlier discussion, is there is that upper 1%. There is that like ultra luxury customer. So I'm just we're answering live on the fly. I'm just thinking through a little bit. Like, yeah. I think like if there is a divergence between, one thought could be if there's a divergence between the stock market and the real economy. So if middle class folks lose their job, but the stock market rallies and the 1% stays wealthy, then maybe you could see a divergence. But generally, these things are going to be correlated, in my opinion. What do you make of it, Lex?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same forces that drive it. I do think I agree with you. It'd be the first to go, just by virtue of it being more expensive. So if we were saying we now had to get to a point where we cut back, you're going to see more domestic travel, I would think. And again, I actually wanted to take it where my head went straight to was, as we were talking about, a slightly rosy scenario for where things stand. I did want to get into some of a risk of what could go wrong. And I am very focused on government spending cuts right now. And that's a big debate that has not been in the headlines other than Doge. But we're talking about things much bigger than Doge, and that's still to come. And so that's when that's a debate that's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to turn out. And that's when we'll be able to answer that kind of a question more in the coming months.
I would also just, I'm just thinking out on the fly here, because these are not real uncoached questions. Outside the U.S. too, I also suspect that business travel is a larger component of international travel. Mm-hmm. You know, the McKinseys of the world do a lot of international travel. So there's probably a larger share of business spending, it's a real share of outbound than in domestically. And so that comes down to not just consumer confidence, but business confidence and CEO confidence. And again, that it all comes back to this. I like the way Sarah said it. It all comes down to, we are in a sense playing chicken with Trump and with confidence and with the stock market. And if we just get that, if we can get our mojo back, right, get our game back, then maybe we avoid this thing, or maybe the hard data, which is like the unemployment data, converges to meet the ill will of the soft data, and then things will be pretty rough, quite honestly.
All right, so the next one, Lex and I have been we've been very involved in this one. What are your views on the travel advisories for major international countries like the UK, Germany, Canada, that could potentially impact inbound travel to the US? So this is my thought on that one. I think the vibes matter. I don't think the warnings matter. That's my gut. I don't think a lot of people are going to, not go on vacation because their country of residence issued a warning. I think it's a little bit of PR. I think it's a little bit of, a public rebuke, perhaps, of the current administration. But I think the vibes matter. The warnings, not so much.
I'm with you. Well, certainly, like I would never have known to go look for a warning on the State Department's website. But the media attention matters, right? And so
yeah, that's right.
I'm skeptical broadly about this kind of thing, but I'm kind of buying that fewer Canadians want to come to the U.S., right? And like when I first saw the news of these German tourists being detained, I was like, gee, those are really isolated circumstances. We don't have the details, but I was like, this could have the potential to be, and I don't read German press, but I could imagine that kind of a thing, like being splashed across, being talked about. And I don't know, if you're planning your trip and you're in Europe, do you say, I want to go to America right now? Everyone's getting fired at national parks. Trash is going to be overflowing. Theater tickets are $1,000 in New York. Do I want to go to the U.S. right now while all this crazy? And by the way, they're being kind of jerks to us. And so I could imagine at the margin it having an impact.
Maybe this is me being a skeptic or just a dumb, arrogant American. But I think, Lex, you've raised a really good point, which is I like your distinction there, which is that they're being jerks to us right now, which arguably we are. I don't think that impacts travel as much as people think. And I think that the State Department stuff matters. I think the worry of, if I go for a national park trip, will the parks be open? If I go to New York City, will I be able to afford theater tickets? Mm-hmm. I think those are the real concerns that matter much, much more. And to the extent that inflation, tariffs fuel inflation, or stronger U.S. dollar and make tickets more expensive, to the extent that federal cuts actually don't just cut spending, but cut like the ability to keep important national parks and tourist attractions open, that to me matters a lot more than is there a warning for X, Y, and Z country, or were they mean to us in a head, would I read a mean headline? Like I think that matters. I don't think it matters as much as people think it does. My opinion.
I agree. I'm still watching. It's kind of like the whole, now people don't want to drive a Tesla. What does it say about you? So again, I don't know what they're saying in different European neighborhoods, but it's like, oh, where are you going on holiday? I'm going to the United States. Like, why are you doing that? Could it escalate to that kind of it is a tarnished brand, in other words, you know what I mean?
That's true.
In some ways, or at least it risks getting there. And why discourage people from visiting is what I would say.
Well, totally, in terms of being a cell phone on the brand. This is a plug. We are putting some more market research out into the field in Skift Research. So we're going to try and quantify how much that sentiment shift matters.
Well, and Lex, we were talking about this morning, just like the story that broke yesterday with the, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic being in the group chat. And so when like Europeans read that story, like what do you think? Like, are you going to come? Are you going to hit, buy on that plane ticket or whatever?
We've got a question here. Do you feel the U.S. will become less competitive as a travel destination compared to other countries that are easing travel restrictions? I think the point of this whole discussion is basically yes, right? We're without even reading that question out loud, we're basically answering that question. Like, brands matter. There's a reason why Marriott invests in brands. There's a reason why destination management organizations invest in brands for their nation. And the USA has a brand. And I think
what our DMO is called.
Visit USA.
Brand
USA.
I'll say too.
I should have known. I'm sorry, Brand USA. I'm sorry. Don't hate me.
There's data there, and there's reporting that we don't have yet. That is something I'm we're very interested in is, so not just, so we're talking about the sentiment, right? Do you want to travel to the United States? And I think people still want to. It's still like a destination. But then there's the practical thing. And we did so much reporting in the past 2 years about visas and just the practical parts about traveling to the U.S. And there have been a lot of improvements. And what we don't know yet is if there are either cutbacks that delay visa processing, or two, more vetting for security reasons that delay visas, all of which just make it more difficult to come. And if you make it more difficult to come, fewer people are going to come. And that's something we're watching closely at. We don't have reporting to back that up. It's just data points to watch in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm not trying to be the one who's like always, I guess I'm a natural half full kind of guy. I would point out again, back to the context. Inbound travel to the United States is about 9% of the U.S. tourism industry. In the past, when things were different, it was closer to 15%. So we're talking somewhere 10, in the order of magnitude of 10 to 15% of inbound travel. $150 billion the last year that we have really good, firm, official government data. $150 billion of inbound travel spent to the United States. In a $1.6 trillion travel economy in the United States and a $10 trillion travel economy globally. So as Americans, we do love to think that we are the center of the universe. Obviously we are, right? Greatest nation ever, something like that. But $150 billion of inbound travel to the United States at risk in a $10 trillion tourism economy, I think that that's good perspective too for people like at home and listening, that like there are other global economies out there besides the United States. There's India, there's China, there's Europe. There are our domestic markets. So there is a lot happening out there. I'm not saying that all those are rosy either. There's plenty of challenges for economic growth in the U.S., challenges for economic growth in Europe, challenges for economic growth in China. There's plenty of risks out there. That's why we downgraded our outlook forecast. But I do want to highlight that context because I think it can be scary, right? Like I read that the Wall Street Journal said, if we lose 10% of Canadians, that's $2 billion of travel spend. $2 billion is a huge number. We can't imagine $2 billion. It's a $10 trillion global economy, right? So for tourism. So these numbers can be a bit tricky sometimes. I think that's just important to say.
All right. I think we have our last question here, which I think is a good one to end on. And I'm going to limit the two of you, and I will go as well, to one word. Yes or no, okay? And then we can talk about it a little bit more. Can we expect uncertainty for the rest of Trump's term? Lex, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Seth?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there we go. Yeah. I think the thing that we've done, I covered Trump 1.0. Lex, I know you did too. Like, it was interesting right after the election. I forget what we were doing, Lex. It's been a blur these last few months. But I was like, oh man, I forgot what this is going to be like. Like, yep, here we are, off to the races. Here we go. For the next 4 years, this is what it's going to be like because it all came flooding back. Exactly what it was like the first time. So yes, dear listener, you out there asking this question, can we expect uncertainty for the rest of Trump's term? I'm afraid so. But I do think the market will live with this uncertainty. That is one thing that I think will happen. That's my gut on it.
The market will start to price in some of this stuff, right? Like, I don't want to get too whatever economist, but like there will be an adjustment. This is what's kind of bullshit thing that sounds smart. That doesn't say much, but like there will be a risk premium that's going to get baked into the stock market, right? And like valuation will adjust for a more uncertain, more volatile environment, and then we'll go from there. And I think that like certainly the headlines and the policies will keep us guessing, but I think ultimately we can. I don't know. We'll see, but that's my view.
Lex, closing thoughts on this?
What Seth just said sounds right to me. I think will it get priced? Like I already am over tariffs a little bit. It's like they kind of jumped the shark. And it's like, But there's a lot of stuff that needs to get figured out through the rest of the year, like this big beautiful bill, tax cut spending. We don't know what that looks like. It's all going to get ugly.
Okay, I have one more question. I just have to ask. Yeah. Yes or no? Does Elon Musk stay in the Trump administration for the entire term?
Oh, entire term.
Yeah, like for the next 4 years, will Chainsaw Elon be a part of all of our lives?
I'm going to go with no 4 years, but yes, longer than perhaps some of the skeptics think right now.
For the sake of controversy, although Lex kind of agrees, I'm going to go with yes. I think he's got longevity. Don't count him out. Oh,
I go with no. I think he's out. I think he's out as soon as business takes too much of a hit.
Interesting.
All right, everybody. I feel like we could talk about this forever. I don't know. Maybe we should do it again. We probably will be able to do it again. Yeah.
Sarah, what are the biggest data points you're paying attention to? What I'm paying attention to is what our Skift journalists report. I'm paying attention to what the executives say, what the earnings say, and I'm reading it on and our upcoming survey data. That's what I'm paying attention to answer that question. A little bit of promotional, right? We got to promote ourselves a little bit.
Yeah, me too. Seth. Yeah, me too, Seth. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Seth and I have a podcast. If you didn't know, tune in, Skift Travel Podcast. And, send us questions, send us feedback. Our emails are all online. And thank you for joining us today. Until next time.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.